So I'd like to invite Jerry Lynch, chair of the College of College of Civil and Environmental Engineering, to introduce our keynote for the noon lecture.
All right, so as Tian said, I'm Jerry Lynch. I'm the department chair of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at the University of Michigan. And I wanted to first, before introducing our distinguished speaker, I wanted to first say thank you to Dean Massey, Tian, and Wes for having this opportunity to be part of such a wonderful event. It's been incredible seeing all the talks this morning, so thank you for inviting us. So it's a great honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Sarah Billington. Professor Billington is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University and a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford. Professor Billington received her bachelor's degree in civil engineering as well as operations research with high honors from Princeton University. She was also awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to study at ETH Zurich from 1990 to 91. Shortly thereafter, she continued on for her graduate studies at UT Austin, receiving both a master's and a PhD degree in structural engineering. She also has an extensive record of work with industry, having had brief periods of work with Skidmore, Owen & Merrill, Electrowatt, as well as Greener Engineering, which is now part of AECOM. Professor Billington began her academic career first as an assistant professor of structural engineering in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University, where she was on the faculty from 1997 to 2002. She then joined the faculty at Stanford University in 2003, and that was the first time I met her, actually, when I was still a graduate student at Stanford. She has twice been a visiting faculty member in civil engineering at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, first in 1998 and then later in 2008, as well as 2009. She has an distinguished record, having received a number of awards and honors over her long career, including paper awards from ACI, as well as being recognized by the National Science Foundation with an Early Career Award, which is one of the highest awards given to a young academic in the sciences and engineering areas. Her past research has focused on sustainable, durable construction materials, including ductile cement-based composites, as well as bio-based composite systems that have a closed-loop life cycle. I'm also excited to see her talk today because I believe it's on some of her newer research areas that are equally pioneering as her past work. And her new areas of research are in how built spaces, both the physical and the digital environment, impact and can sustain human health and well-being. So join me in welcoming Professor Billington for this morning's keynote.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jerry, and thank you for inviting me and being willing to let me talk about something that's been really exciting me more these past couple of years. As Jerry mentioned, I've been doing research on, let me just advance that. Oh, that's me. Oh, is this? Okay, that's the, I don't know what the other Sorry. Yeah, my past research has been on pre-stressed and reinforced concrete and ductile concretes. I've been to Michigan many times, collaborating with Victor Lee and Jim White. And then I got into bio-based composites, but more recently I've been really interested in how all of these materials are impacting our health and well-being. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So my co-speaker is not here, unfortunately, but he is James Landay, and he is a professor of computer science at Stanford. And so the motivation for our project, we're leading a large interdisciplinary project on this topic, and the motivation is that people are, or many Americans are overstressed, overweight, tend to be wasteful, unhappy, and many feel isolated, either at work or at school. And we spend much of our time with these afflictions indoors, inside the built environment, 87% of our time, according to the EPA. So imagine the worst room you've ever spent time in. How did it make you feel? So for me, it was a couple years ago, and I was in the faculty pub on campus at Stanford, and it's this enclosed room with cinder block walls. They've actually since renovated it, but it was cinder block walls, no natural light, dingy, gray, beige. It was really oppressive. And actually, the experience of leaving a meeting that I had spent 2 hours in there was what inspired me to start going into a new direction of research. My colleague James, it was his grad student office. Pretty common experience. He almost dropped out. Now he knows why. But maybe you haven't had that experience of being in a horrible space. So imagine this is Kate, and she's in her office here. Can we do that again where it's not quite so loud? Okay, thanks. It's not usually that bad. Okay, so Kate is in her office. It's noisy, a lot of artificial light, a lot of artificial furniture. It's hard to get work done in here and feel good. And these, these building attributes and building features impact her psychologically and emotionally and physically. She might experience stress, anxiety, distraction, and this actually impacts the organization in terms of its finances and how people might be using or wasting resources, as well as it can really change the cultural norms of the company. And it doesn't really stop there, because if the organizations are being impacted this way, it is going to affect society, our economy, our environment, and the public health and well-being. I think this audience probably can believe that building features could have this big an effect. Some audiences don't, but just to give a concrete example of that the building features can really affect society, I'd want to give one example here of absenteeism. So it costs US companies about $226 billion a year. It's a big problem. So most of this is likely due to long hours or a lousy boss or low pay. But there is one study, for example, that has shown that a lack of nature, so offices like Kate's, actually accounted for about 10% of the absenteeism in that office. And if this were true in general, that would be $23 billion in the US economy. And even if it was just a couple percent, it would still be several billion dollars. So it's could have a pretty big impact. So the framework for our research is that building features not only have individual impacts, but also organizational and societal outcomes. So we've been inspired by this quote, which has been used a lot, and it's a little bit out of context, but Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us." And what we really like is the "they shape us" part, because they do. Buildings shape us. And so our thought is, well, what can we do? How can we make buildings shape us in positive ways that keep improving over time, that really last and adhere? So we have some ambitious CS undergrads that created a video for us to kind of imagine the workplace of the future. I hope this one's the right volume, and I want to just share that it's brief with you here. This was a couple years ago, just a concept video. So imagine an office in the future where a digital display reflecting worker activity can inspire them to get more exercise. Where they might take the stairs instead of the elevator and thereby save on building energy. Or imagine that we could personalize temperature for different individuals, so some aren't too cold and some aren't too hot. Or where we could actively cancel noise so that an open office floor plan wouldn't be so distracting to work in. Or where the building could infer the stress of a worker and, sensing their stress, adapt scenery, maybe to provide natural scenery, play some music, lower the lights in maybe a non-creepy way. Or imagine digital art built into the walls that could encourage people to meet other people they haven't met before. And to perhaps even lead them outside to take a break. Just a quick acknowledgement. So how would we get to this future? Well, first, there is a lot that we do know about having buildings that might support well-being. So we do know things like greenery and living walls improve mood, they lower blood pressure, they can decrease hospital stays, increase mental engagement. We know that daylighting, natural lighting, can lead to better concentration and increased productivity. And we also know that social engagement and inclusion can reduce stress. But there's actually very little information on how a built environment might impact that belonging, that inclusion. So at the outset of trying to propose this project, actually, we did an online survey. This was exciting coming from concrete research because we got all this data in 1 hour. Did not have to wait 28 days to test anything. So there were over 300 participants, half men and half women. It was with the Mechanical Turk online survey that we did. And we asked them to imagine that they're starting a new job, and we showed them a series of pictures. And the main variables were natural materials, natural light, and diverse representations. And then we asked them about their belonging, their self-efficacy, and their environmental efficacy using sort of known instruments from psychology. And across the board, with one exception, their sense of belonging, their self-efficacy, and their environmental efficacy increased statistically significantly when they thought they were going to be somewhere with natural materials, natural light, and diverse representations. And this was particularly interesting with the belonging and the diverse representations for women and people of color, as we know from business studies that a lot of businesses have increased profits when they have more gender and racial diversity in their workforce. So we know that also just across the board with all of these things that we're onto something, and we're not the only ones. Of course, there is this nascent sort of well-building movement that everyone here is probably familiar with, and lots of things coming out like checklists, a little bit like LEED. And why is it so popular? Well, I've made the economic argument before, but another one is just to say that a company putting a lot of money into a building, actually, when you think about how much money is going into the building, 90% is actually going into the salaries. Just 1% maybe into energy. So if you can tweak something by 10%, you'd really want to tweak the productivity or the wellness of your employees. So that's why this is gaining, I think, more attention. But the issue is that the research behind it is pretty piecemeal and not very thorough. So the studies are generally like they're short-term, they're limited populations, just like one gender, one ethnicity. They're like before, after, and a lot of self-report. And so what we really need to do is fill in the missing pieces of this puzzle and take a more integrated approach to how the built environment is affecting our well-being. So how can we do this? We're inspired by another quote, which is, when you cannot measure it, you have scarcely advanced to the stage of science, by Lord Kelvin. And so the point is you need to measure it. So that's what we're focusing on first. And so our project is really trying to establish the science of what building features impact what occupant states in naturalistic settings and over the long term. But we do have to start in the lab, so it's also sort of a lab to site thing. We really need to understand acceptance constraints, what people are going to be willing to accept in terms of what we're inferring about them, and then design adaptations that could support the well-being over the long term and make sure that it really adheres. So along with those goals, or those 3 things that we're doing, we have research questions for each one, and I want to start with just the first 2. So again, how do building attributes impact occupant states in naturalistic settings over longer periods of time? And then how can we use AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, for example, to detect occupant states in a privacy-securing manner? And then I'll get to the interventions later. But so what we're doing basically is running experiments where we are systematically varying things like the views to nature, diverse symbols, and temperature and airflow variability. Also things like access to greenery indoors or water features, a lot of things from the biophilic design movement, I guess you could say. And when varying these features in our experiments, we are trying to measure well-being. And there are a lot of definitions for well-being. What we're focusing on is not sort of one standard one, but we're focusing on stress, belonging, creativity, physical activity, and environmental behavior. And I'd say the stress and physical activity have been studied pretty well, but not so much on belonging, creativity, and environmental behavior, so the building's impact. And so the way we're doing this is starting with, we are going to do self-report, but we're moving sort of beyond the simple surveys. And we're using something called experience sampling methods, where you sort of ping somebody during the day periodically and just ask a quick question or two to get that self-report. And then we're going to take advantage of all of the building sensors that we have in our buildings, especially in smart buildings, so like occupancy sensors or energy or recycling, and make use of that data. And then much of our data will come from leveraging the personal devices that we all have, so watches, phones, laptops. And together with those three, we can then triangulate in on what building features might be causing which outcomes. Because the self-report alone, we have seen, for example, that people might report that they're calm looking at real nature versus a screen that shows nature, but actually when you measure their electrodermal activity, they're quite agitated by the screen compared to the real. So that's why we need to have these three different pieces to try to infer what's going on. And so let me give you a couple examples, or three examples actually. And so one would be here, like if we wanted to, oh, this is Kate, she's in her new office now. And so we want to check on her like environmental behavior, infer that from various sensors. So we could use the building data of energy and recycling. We can use her smartwatch to detect if she's using stairs versus elevator. And then we can periodically ask her things about her environmental efficacy and her environmental attitudes or connection to nature. So that's one example. Another would be belonging. So for example, we could use the occupancy sensors to sense how much social interaction she's having. My colleagues in computer science have experience using mobile phones to detect affect in speech, but in a privacy-conserving manner, so it's non-conversational. But you can tell from the affect if they're having positive social interactions or not. And then again, asking basically the self-report on belonging. Another way to find out a little bit about social interaction, just to give you some of the technologies behind this, most of these technologies are off the shelf. And they might, the computer scientists tell me they have to maybe write some new algorithms and things, but it's mostly off the shelf. But there is some new research that's going on too. And one of my colleagues, Rishi Jain, in my department, and his grad student, Andrew Santa, they've used the plug loads. I didn't actually realize that the plug load is variable on my charger, but it varies depending on how much activity you are doing on your laptop. And so they can track that and see when people are active versus on break. And they've done this in an office in San Francisco and also at a place in one of Stanford's hubs. And so you can kind of see where the activity is happening. And this could be useful for like building energy. So if there's certain people that are working at certain times of day, you might want to actually clump them in certain areas so your zone management can be a little bit more energy efficient. But they're also developing network models to try to understand when people are on break and who might be interacting with whom. Again, to sort of that, and we might be able to use that for belonging, but we're just starting to talk to them about that. And then the last example would be something like stress, where this is kind of similar. So occupancy to see how much social interaction they're having. Again, the affect from mobile and the self-report. But the other interesting one here would be laptop or mouse usage. You can actually get a sense of people's stress based on how they're using the trackpad. And this is the data from that. And this is from Pablo Paredes, a colleague of mine, and he's at the School of Medicine now. And this is a little bit more of a dense slide, so let me just explain. He did an experiment where people were either like showed a calm video or they were stressed out by making them do math, which most people get stressed out by. So the two people that didn't get stressed at all by the math, their data was actually thrown out. So, but so the point of this is on the graph on the left, so the self-reported stress. The idea is if they were shown the relaxing thing, they self-reported being relaxed. If they were stressed by math, they self-reported the math. And then they were asked to, after being shown, after being sort of conditioned that way, they were asked to do things on the trackpad, like a point and click or steer something or drag and drop. And so that was that the T stressed and T relaxed. Again, while they were doing that activity or after that activity, after having seen a calm video, they report relaxed. So the point on the left is just that the conditioning worked. and maintained that some were calm and some were relaxed. And then so the kind of finding is what's on the right, and I probably would have plotted it differently, but this actually is statistically significant. There was a 5% difference in the average area of pressure of the finger on the trackpad when they were stressed versus when they were relaxed. So there would be a way to figure out or to infer that somebody is more stressed based on how they're using their trackpad. That's kind of the point of this. And the D number is the Cohen's effect, which is reasonable. So yeah, so that's another just example. Now, all of this data is pretty personal and sensitive, and workers might not like this, and I'll show you later that we're pretty sure they're not going to like a lot of this. So as we're doing this research, we're not just going to say that everything will be private and secure, but it's actually a big part of our research agenda. And so we have experts from the law school who are privacy experts working on the project with us. And so we're using mixed method assessments, so finding out what people think about this, and then also asking them like how might they want to communicate their privacy preferences to the building or within the building to try to get that kind of information. So these are both technical and non-technical approaches too. And then all studies would be opt-in. No one has to do this study if we're doing it in an office space. It's opt-in, and they would have the option of deleting any data they want. Having a really bad day, they can go in and delete their data, and we won't see any of it. Of course, it's all anonymized too. And then security, we have CS people that are security experts, and as researchers, no one sees the data unless it's a need-to-know basis. And again, it is all anonymized and through the IRB. But it is a research agenda for us. So where are we now? And then at the end, I'll get to the interventions. But what we're doing is controlled lab study, where we have 2 rooms, and we're systematically varying some of these variables. And we're going to have over 400 participants. We're at about 2/3 of the way through. So now I'm back to something that's even worse than concrete research, because it takes a lot longer than 28 days to get this data. But it's, and we're not really allowed to look at it, so I can't tell you too much about it yet, because you're not allowed to look at it, or at least not check the hypotheses until it's over. So we're working on that, and we're designing field studies, working with different companies, again, sort of going from lab to site. And then we're doing some more of these online studies, and that's what I want to just show. And they are called in the wild studies, and we're doing these to sort of generate new hypotheses. And so the goal here is to collect sort of naturalistic data. So instead of like getting people online to say, okay, imagine you're working in this space, we're just saying, okay, where are you working? What does your space look like? And then we ask them to do certain tasks. So it's just, again, the sort of in the wild thing. So we're trying to observe links between everyday built environments and their well-being on kind of a broader scale. So it's from all around the world. Oh wait, actually, I think maybe we were just doing this in the US so far. So we asked people to report on and take photos of their current workspace and then complete these self-assessments. So far we have 71 people. It could be a lot more, because again, you can get this data pretty quickly, but we're going kind of slowly just to see what we're finding, because you'd have to pay them for the survey. And at first, almost everybody was working from home, and so that wasn't quite what we wanted. So now we've sort of made it, if they say they're home, we just kick them out and pay them a little bit, and they don't take the rest of the survey. But so this data has about 20 people that were home and the rest that were in an office space. And these were what the office spaces look like, just examples of them. So they were in libraries, cafes, other corporate locations and things, which is kind of interesting that they were taking this survey then at work. But so considering our lab study variables, of natural light, natural materials, and diverse representation. So like we asked them about that in their spaces. We have found some confirmation of our hypotheses, which is really pretty exciting. So people with natural light in their space showed higher levels of creativity, both divergent and convergent, and lower stress that we would expect, but the creativity was exciting to see that that's happening even in this small data set, and also higher convergent creativity when they had natural materials more around them. And then the diverse representations, again, sort of supporting the first original study, they do have a higher feeling of belongingness in their environment. And then we also are using this data to sort of generate new hypotheses. So, and some of this stuff isn't so new. Like a lot of people have studied air quality, temperature, and all of these things. But again, kind of around belonging, creativity, a little bit of pro-environmental activity or awareness. We have not seen as much data out there. So we're seeing these kinds of trends that air quality and quiet can help with belonging, temperature can actually help with creativity, increase creativity. So these are kind of interesting things that we might then be able to use when we're done with our controlled lab study, where we have 2 rooms. We can try to test out some of these hypotheses as well. And now about the privacy and security part, this was, I guess, not surprising, but it sort of shows how important it is that all of our studies are going to be opt-in. So not being monitored at work was somewhat or very important to 75% of the respondents. And 64% said they would be very concerned or somewhat concerned that someone has access to this passively sensed data, as would we too. And so we're now planning a set of studies that will directly engage with these issues. Another thing is that the idea is that you would have this sort of inference platform that would help support well-being. It would kind of change the role of a building manager, so that they could, instead of being like, no, you're not allowed to eat over there, they're like, oh, well, people want to eat over there. Let's figure out how to make that work, because that's going to be supporting them, their well-being. So it's sort of a different take on building management. But again, like we wouldn't want it to be like the employers are trying to figure out what people are doing and get mad at them or something. So so there's a lot of sensitivity. But again, another thing is that we would really hope that we could infer things without too much personal data. So that's kind of the idea of the triangulation and using machine learning so that we don't have to actually use all that personal data, but we could still kind of infer things about their well-being. And that's really the work of the computer scientists. So the last thing then is the design adaptations to support well-being. So once we know what works and what really helps, we can begin to design these adaptations. And so to support their well-being, again, try not to be creepy about it. And you don't want the lights to dim and be like, oh boy, Bob is pretty stressed or something, in an office environment. So on the digital side, there have been things like this, and like was in the concept video, but you could imagine, for instance, maybe the pedals on this digital display, large public ambient displays, or they could be displays on your phones or watches that would represent something. So like the pedals here, the colors could represent the energy usage of a working group in an office or something, and it can kind of nudge behavior. You've seen the aquariums with the fish, and that's tied to your Fitbit, maybe how active you are, but nobody has to know who's who, And so some other brainstorming that some of the students were doing over the summer, like in the middle one, would be like a community garden, and everybody's, maybe activity level is related to, or well-being is related to how many flowers are growing in the garden, and that could be a large ambient display. Or you can have objects. People are creating objects that, depending on their activity level, if they're really busy, it's closed, but if they're less busy, it's a little bit more open. It sort of signals that they're open for discussion or collaboration at that time or something. Or tactile displays that you could interact with that would be biophilic as well. Some of the other ideas that they're thinking of. And again, it really comes a lot from early work on attention restoration theory by Kaplan, and then also stress recovery. So how nature has a restorative impact. And then on the physical side, here's some concrete. We're thinking of things like how to get more greenery indoors. So living wall systems are pretty expensive, and they often die pretty quickly, or they're just very expensive to maintain. So we're thinking about some things there, and then also how to make natural ventilation, which is only really workable or truly workable in certain environments. And if we could extend the temperature ranges where we could use natural ventilation, we know that that would have good impact on well-being, as also just health with the air quality. And so in a little more detail, so we've tried, not too successfully, but with pervious concrete to grow moss, for example. And I could not find a moss. There's like one moss expert in Northern California, and he wouldn't answer my emails. So we haven't gotten very far with this. But the idea there is just that there's no roots. It's not going to break the concrete. It doesn't actually need a lot of nutrients. It just needs water. But maybe if the the physical walls, modular walls could be moved around that are green, but just lower cost, because that's a big issue. And then on the natural ventilation side, we're interested in some work that was actually done by an architect at CMU, Dana Kopkova, who I met at a conference once, and there were some interesting things about the morphology of the walls. So we do a lot with thermal mass with the floor. And I'd love to talk to Forrest about this more, but we're thinking of, can we do something more with the walls? And my colleague, Katrine Gourlay, she's a computational modeler of airflow and wind engineering, and she's interested in natural ventilation also. And so we're doing some models of airflow over like a plate that has different morphologies. And you actually do get a difference in the convective heat transfer, which isn't huge, but it is something. And so we're trying to see if there might be a way to play with the morphologies and also the actual materials. I'm thinking of using some waste materials in there like biochar that might be able to change the thermal properties, just to see if we can kind of control temperature in other ways within a building. So it's all very exploratory, but those are just a couple examples of the digital. I mentioned that my past work has been in reinforced concrete, pre-stressed concrete, so we're still doing a little bit of that. But I've also worked a lot in bio-based composites. And I just mentioned this, but I haven't quite figured out how to link this yet into this research. But the bio-based composites are something that it's a polymer that grows in bacteria. Is there a pointer on? Oh, yeah. So a polymer that grows inside bacteria. The bacteria grabs carbon from the environment and stores it as polymer, kind of the way we store fat. It's an energy reserve. And then you mix it with natural fibers or wood flour to make a composite that's kind of like wood, but it's more rapidly renewable. Could be used in the construction industry, for instance, with formwork. Anaerobically biodegrades to methane, and then you feed that methane to the bugs, the bacteria, and you get more polymer. So it's a closed loop. So anywhere that there's waste gas, you could grow plastic. So there's a startup that's working on this. We've made some foams, so try to get better acoustic and moisture resistant, but acoustic foams for building materials. And then the big question is just about the durability. So this is a traditional wood polymer composite. They're not that durable. And ours aren't either, but it leads to questions of like the life cycle. So if maybe it's got a shorter life cycle, but even if you have to use it twice, if you have to replace it more often, it could still be greener. Anyway, so this is another whole area of research I've been doing, but it hasn't really made it into the built environment. It does have sort of the look of a natural material, so it might be something interesting to test out eventually on the well-being side, and it could be when people know about it, it could impact the environmental behaviors as well. Right now, I think there's a little bit of fully bio-based composites on like for trims and flooring and stuff, but it's not a big market yet. It's not cheap enough yet, basically. So so again, just what we're working on is like trying to establish the science with these controlled lab studies and then doing field studies. So we originally were working with WeWork. Don't think that's going to happen anymore, unfortunately. But we do have some contacts at Google and some other companies locally that are very interested in well-being. So we're going to be setting up field studies, again, understanding the acceptance constraints and design adaptations, and then the goal in the long term is to kind of release the platform, the sort of inference platform that other building managers could use, so other owners would know what their workers need in their space. And we're very interested in bringing this into sort of like shift workers or the nighttime workers, also in the factories or warehouses. There's interest there. One of our original concept videos was a homeless shelter. We hope that it will have a much wider impact than just sort of the fancy looking offices that I was showing before. And it would be really important to be able to then just measure the long-term adherence and impacts, because most of the before-after studies of green buildings, they're not really going over the long term. So we don't really know if there's like a die-off effect once you get used to it, or how do we keep supporting it as we move along. So I mentioned this is a really big project. So James is right next to me up there on the right with the blue box. He's in computing. And so this is sort of the team, not including most of the students. And we represent actually all 7 schools at Stanford. It's part of a program that Stanford had called Catalyst for Collaborative Solutions. That was the grant, or where we got the funding for this research. And yeah, so we have people that represent buildings, computing, and people, sort of the social sciences. And again, our goals to really understand which building attributes impact occupant states in naturalistic settings over long periods, developing the science infrastructure and methodologies that allow others to learn more and be user acceptable and privacy conserving, and then design several digital and physical interventions based on inferring well-being so that our buildings can adapt. So the ultimate goal is not only that we're having a very resilient infrastructure, but also one in which people can flourish and thrive. Thank you. So there's lots of time for questions, if you have any. Oh, yeah. The cube. Oh, that's nice.
Hi, thank you for the interesting presentation. My name is Ala Al-Gargouj. I'm a PhD student in architecture, and my research is on the impact of architectural acoustics in well-being, so that was really interesting to me. You mentioned the effect of sound on well-being, and you mentioned some of the results on how it improved the sense of belonging and how it reduced stress. So I'm interested in learning, how did you modify or change the acoustics in the project, and was it only active noise cancellation, or was there any passive solution with the architectural design?
So the data that I showed with that was just from that online survey, so it wasn't a controlled study.
Okay.
It was just finding out what people were describing about their environment, and then we would see how much they felt a sense of belonging or stress. And so we could link the two. And there were correlations, and I think a colleague did like t-tests to kind of see that this was holding, but we haven't actually done the active controlled study of it yet. So, but for sure, we also are thinking that we might get some data about that with our controlled lab study, because it's basically 2 offices in a building at Stanford that we converted to make seem like they're conference rooms. But like the building manager is next to one of them, and sometimes he was kind of noisy. So, so we think that and we're getting that data, like of how much stress, because we have those rooms are like fully sensed out. So we might get a little bit more data just from that. It wasn't controlled, but we might get some ideas. And then we're going to do the experiments that would have sound issues with them. And I think we would be looking at some of the technologies that are actively controlling. There are several companies that have it, but also definitely the passive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have 2 questions.
Sure.
I'm struck by the desire not to be creepy.
The
desire not to be creepy.
Right.
And some people are just creeped out by being in this kind of building. And so to what extent do you prepare for eventually having to cater to only actually really one kind of person who finds this kind of building as a subcategory of well-being as opposed to creepy? So that's the first question. Like, to what extent do you control for your own presence at all being creepy, whether it's, you only use the lights as an example of the creepiness? But being a responsive building, in a responsive building,
right,
on the one hand might just creep people out. And then
right,
my other question, which is a mirror image, is have you accounted for the fact that people feel proud of being in such a building, and thus that contributes to their well-being? So how much do you control for your own feedback, basically?
Oh, that's really interesting. So let's see. The creepiness thing, I think, we're going to have to find that out by when we do the experiments. So one example with the plug loads, nobody seemed to care. So that was kind of a positive thing. Yet with our naturalistic study, they were like, whoa, I don't want to be monitored. But I think like once it's happening, maybe people don't realize. Or, that's not really a good thing.
But you're waiting for there to be a moving wall of acceptance, something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And for sure, like, we would, again, I think like at the experiment level, things are, they're wearing watches and they're wearing ED, like these things called empatica. We wouldn't do that in the field. Or, we might ask people to wear watches, but not everybody is going to in a building. So I think the idea is to get as much data as we can to see what matters, and then kind of figure out what level of monitoring would be acceptable, or changes and adaptations. There's also a really important piece which the psychologists always bring up, which is just having more agency. So you don't want the building to be doing everything You know, it's kind of like when you can't open Windows. That drives me nuts. So, you know, it's like so we definitely would want to be thinking about building an agency for people as well. And the second question again? Sorry.
Well, to what extent are you factoring in pride in being at such an environment?
Yeah. So I think that has probably come out in some of the before-after studies. People moving from a non-green to a green building, and they're all very upbeat and positive. But we don't know if it adheres, and how long. So but we do think that just a feeling is that if you are having the building constantly trying to improve, or the building managers are thinking about well-being, not just energy, that then it would adhere. That's sort of the hope. Yeah, it's a great question. So.
I'll just tag onto that and
Sure.
maybe help out on the building side, measuring the things that make you feel creepy. Do you have a kind of breakdown of the fact that buildings are already measuring a bunch of things that we're doing with them all the time anyway from the background data? And do you break down between those and how the things that maybe you would want to measure in a more responsive building, whether or not those can be aligned better with like the more conventional building systems and they kind of fall into the background, or whether it's necessary that people accept them or be the proactive type?
Exactly. And that's the point about doing the triangulation in our experiments, is to see which pieces of data we really need, right, to understand the well-being. Because it would be great if it could just be from the building sensors alone, for example. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a very fascinating project. I think that we found the modernist in the room that we were looking for before now in terms of like saving society through design. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit. You've talked about sort of the reception of the workers and the impact, and that sort of seems to be that was your focus of your presentation. But obviously you've been working with, you know, the managers, the ones on the corner office, to implement these.
But not yet, but yeah.
Not yet? Because so perhaps you can sort of predict a little bit the reasons why they would invest in these kinds of design beyond, you know, being benevolent to the workers. So probably that's how they would talk about it out in the world. But why are they doing this for their own gain? I mean, what's the gain?
I think the biggest gain is the economics. So, I mean, for example, the one with the plug loads that my colleague did, I think the argument was much more for the energy savings that could be had by understanding who's working at what times of day more, kind of, or who's busier. So you can have savings on energy costs. But I think the point is that if you can improve the well-being and basically also your health and mental health, and that also brings down the costs of insurance, you know, and all of those things that the companies are investing in, and the absenteeism. And then also presenteeism is the other one, where you're present but not working, which we're kind of guilty of making people do by having them do these surveys, right? Because they're doing our survey while they're at work. Maybe they're on break, but yeah, so I think it's mostly the economic one, that they're putting so much money into the people that if they can support their well-being more, Yeah, and so we have had, there's sort of always a battle, I think, between the staff at Stanford, or I mean any institution probably, and the faculty doing research on buildings and stuff. They're not a battle, but sometimes it's really productive and sometimes it's not. But we've had a lot of support from the Stanford facilities people to do this. So I think they see the benefit for the people. It's like the wellness programs, but trying to make it something that'll really last, because they often don't. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Billington. Thanks for your excellent presentation. And I want to ask a question, like in my life experience. I don't know how many people have the same experience, like as many students like living in like apartments, and we have this same experience, like having noise from the upper like stairs, like. Yep. Because I have been living on the first floor, and there have been like step noise from the upper stairs, and but when I was in China, like many of the buildings were built in concrete, and here I think most of them are based on wood or wood pieces.
The smaller ones.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if the concrete building has an advantage, like. From like preventing the noise from other buildings or other floors, and do you think is there any like other materials like would keep the noise like beside concrete, like or how about in future will this being taken into account when we are designing buildings? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not an acoustics expert, but I think there probably is a lot of work on that with the concrete. I mean, in our building, for instance, it's a thermal mass, so it's an open floor. It's very noisy because there's no carpets. But if you put the carpet in, then it kind of ruins the thermal mass thing. I don't think concrete is necessarily better with the noise. But I'm not an expert, so I don't know. That's just from my own like experience. But then they do things like they'll put fabric panels around and stuff, so the acoustic experts know how to handle that. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question fully though. Like, I think more and more noise is being taken into account for sure. There's a lot of interest in that, especially with companies going to the open office floor plans and the distraction of that, and then everyone having to put headphones on, and then they're actually emailing each other even though they're like 2 paces away. Like it does something to the culture of the organization. So I think there is a lot of interest in figuring out, novel ways of dealing with the noise cancellation. We are just focusing on office and education right now, not so much homes, like on apartments, but that is a real issue too. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Tim. I've worked in offices for 30 years, and I was just noticed on your slides, everything looked like the open office environment. Do you have, is that what it's primarily focused on, or are you kind of making some comparisons to workers who have a closed office space or higher partition walls between their offices? Because just from personal experience, I hate working in a completely open office environment with no partitions, but.
Yeah. So, no, we're definitely interested in all kinds. And I think like also from that naturalistic one, in the wild, a lot of people are just in their own single offices. And our field studies would certainly be with places that are probably going to have both. And so it's definitely targeted also to those closed ones, because the enclosed ones, especially if they don't have natural light, I mean, there are countries where it's like, by law, you have to have an access to a view, and here we don't. So for sure, we're interested in both, because I think that can be oppressive. One person that heard a similar talk who works at Facebook, said that they're in an open office, but everyone actually kind of likes it because it's actually like a double height, and they have natural light. So that kind of made sense to me, that there was some competing factors that helped make it like a better place for them. But no, it's not that we're like promoting open offices or anything. It's just kind of a reality that there are so many. So we're trying to make it work for both kinds of offices. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just really quick, first, great talk. You talk quite a bit about productivity, well-being. Have you given thought to how you would assess creativity within space, right? So a lot of those companies probably would be more keen on creativity as opposed to productivity, although they probably couple.
Right. So we're not actually measuring productivity. We are just doing creativity as one of our outcomes. And so what we're doing there are just the kind of established from psychology, their instruments that they use. So convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Like there's a classic example of you have a brick, how many things can you do with a brick? And you just write down as many things as you can do. And that would be kind of I think the divergent. And then convergent would be, there are things like filling in the blanks for the words. So these are just tasks that have been sort of validated by the psychologists as being indicative of creativity. And that's what we're having them do. So we're definitely, and it was nice in the naturalistic study to see that both natural materials and natural light led to that increase in creativity relative to when people didn't have that. So we're hopeful that that's going to come out of our controlled lab study. That's the one that the psychologists really want to see, then they'll really believe it. Yeah. I know you guys have lunch, so we have lunch waiting.
You touched upon people sitting and texting to their neighbor right down the road. How are you treating these new generations of people coming up who are using their cell phones, their pods and so on, and not communicating directly, and using texting and other ways to communicate in this open office environment? How do you How are you addressing collaboration and FaceTime and that direct communication, which I think we see disappearing as younger people move into the workforce?
Yeah, I'm a parent of 2 teenagers, so see that too. So I would say that would, we're not necessarily directly addressing that, but the way we are would be by trying to infer like sense of belonging, which a lot of times has to do with the social inclusion and also stress. So how much social activity and interaction you're having. So the more face-to-face you have, probably they know generally in a lot of studies that there is less stress. And then we're seeing here that also when there's more social inclusion or diverse representations, there's that sense of belonging, which would also lead to more interactions with people. So it's more that if we can support that belonging and lowering stress, that we are probably increasing the social, but we're not directly trying to get people to talk more. I would say the plug load thing, again, this would get a little bit dicey in terms of what the managers get to see, because I could imagine the managers or higher ups in the office could want to look at the data and see, okay, I need to do other programs to get people to be talking more. And I don't know if we would want them to use the data for that, maybe, but like with the plug load data where they're trying to make the network models of figuring out who's interacting with whom to sort of understand like when they should, which people should be working together, which ones are collaborative, which would make successful teams. So you could use the data a little bit for that too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, why don't we it's lunchtime, but I want to thank our keynote speaker at this noon, Sarah. So thank you so much.